Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at the new 3rd gen Ryzen 3 processors from AMD, the 3100 and the 3300X. Roughly 2 weeks ago now, AMD did officially announce these CPUs and Tim covered them in a News Corner episode. But basically, AMD let everyone know that they had some new 3rd gen Ryzen quad-core processors with SMT support on the way, and they'd be coming in as low as $100 US. Now, if you missed that announcement, here is bit of a quick recap. The Ryzen 3 3100 is set to cost just $100. It features 4 cores with 8 threads, and it clocks between 3.6 and 3.9 GHz depending on the workload. And for such an affordable processor, it does feature a rather large 18 megabytes of cache. Unsurprisingly, it is a 65 watt TDP part, and as such, AMD is including the Wraith Stealth cooler, though we didn't get the actual retail packaging, so we don't have the exact Wraith Stealth cooler that comes with it, but we have many Wraith Stealth coolers so we can provide those temperature results later in the video. But anyway, I think it's fair to say the 3100 looks to be a really nice addition at this price point. Then we have the 3300X, which costs $20 more, so $120 US, and it too is a 4-core, 8-thread part that packs a 65 watt TDP and comes bundled with the Wraith Stealth cooler. It also has an 18 megabyte cache, but the cores are clocked between 3.8 and 4.3 gigahertz. Now, you might think a 10% increase in clock frequency is a bit weak for a 20% increase in price, but there is a bit more to it. The 3100 and 3300X feature a different topology, so in other words, they're arranged differently within the core complex die. As a refresher, the 3rd gen Ryzen core chiplet die, or CCD for short, contains 2 core complexes, often referred to as CCXs. Each CCX contains 4 cores, so a fully enabled CCD will contain a total of 8 cores. Throw 2 of them together on the one package and you get the Ryzen 9 3950X, for example. In the case of the 3100 and 3300X, both feature a single CCD, but of course just half the cores are active, as these are quad-core processors. The Ryzen 3 3100 features 2 active CCXs, each with 2 cores, 4 threads and 8 megabytes of L3 cache. In simple terms, AMD would call this a 2+2 configuration, and it means when using more than 2 cores, there will be crosstalk between the CCX modules, which does increase latency. The Ryzen 3 3300X, on the other hand, features just a single active CCX, and that means all 4 cores are housed in the same CCX, and this reduces core-to-core latency, and it also unifies the 16 megabyte L3 cache for all the cores and threads, which will translate into better multi-core performance. That being the case, the 3300X could very well be worth the $20 premium. As for the competition, AMD has positioned the R3 3100 to do battle with Intel's Core i3-9100 series, though that is a bit of a messy matchup as the 9100F right now is priced at just $75, but the iGPU-enabled 9100, that's $135. Since the R3 3100 doesn't have an iGPU, I think the cheaper 9100F makes more sense for comparison, so Intel does have the price advantage there, but then the 9100F is just a 4-core, 4-threaded part, so that is likely going to be a bit of a brutal matchup for the blue team. Having said that, the real matchup will be Intel's upcoming Core i3 10100. Pretty weird name, but anyway, we should be getting used to that 10th gen core series naming soon. I think Tim's almost up to speed with it. Anyway, the 10100, it's a 4-core, 8-thread CPU that operates between 3.6 and 4.3 gigahertz with a tray price of $122 US. Then competing with the R3 3300X right now is the Core i5-9400F, and it's likely going to be an even tougher matchup for Intel right now. At best, the 6-core, 6-thread Intel CPU costs $140 US, but more often than not is priced closer to the $180 US MSRP. Still, it'll be interesting to see how these two CPUs compare in terms of performance. The cheapest Core i5 processor Intel has coming with the Comet Lake series is the 10400, but it's a 6-core 12-thread processor, so it's likely to be a class above the R3 3300X. And that means moving forward, the 3300X will be taking on Comet Lake's Core i3 range. Now, moving past the new 3rd gen Ryzen 3 processors for a moment, AMD has also made mention of their upcoming B550 chipset. Yes, the long-awaited B550 will be here soon, as boards are set to become available on June 16th. The highlights here include PCIe 4.0 support for graphics cards and NVMe storage. To be clear though, the chipset itself doesn't actually support PCIe 4.0, rather B550 motherboards do. There's no PCIe 4.0 lanes attached to the chipset. Instead, AMD is allowing B550 motherboards to use the PCIe 4.0 lanes from the 3rd gen Ryzen processors. That said, the PCIe lanes have still been upgraded when compared to the B450 and X570 chipsets. Whereas the 400 series chipsets featured PCIe 2.0, B550 now gets PCIe 3.0, so that's a pretty big deal. In addition to that, B550 boards now support dual GPUs. Previously, that feature was exclusive to X470 and X570 boards. Not exactly an exciting addition, but I'm sure someone will find it useful. So, in total, the B550 chipset supports 4 PCIe 3.0 lanes, with the option for 2 more PCIe 3.0 lanes or an additional 2 SATA 6 gigabits per second ports. There are also 4 fixed SATA 6 gigabits per second ports, 6 USB 2.0 ports, 2 USB 3 ports, and 2 USB 3.1 ports. Again, B550 motherboards will be hitting shelves on June 16th, and I plan to get as many of them as I possibly can for some in-depth VRM temperature testing. For today's Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X benchmarking, I'll be using the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master, along with 32GB of DDR4 3200 CL14 memory. So all 4 DIMM slots have been populated, so it'll be running as dual ranked memory. The exact same memory configuration has been used to test all the Intel CPUs on the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Ultra. Also, unless specified otherwise, all AMD and Intel CPUs have been cooled using the Corsair Hydro H150i Pro 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler. Finally, the data in this video is fresh and has been updated where need be. The bulk of the data has been gathered over the past few weeks using the latest 1909 Windows 10 build and the latest available BIOS for each motherboard. I did start by testing the AMD CPUs first, but unfortunately I did run out of time, so I wasn't able to test all the CPUs that I would have liked to. Parts such as the 1st gen Ryzen 3s, they were not included. As I said, unfortunately just didn't have time to do that, but I will go back and I'll feature them for future content. Also, while I have included the relevant competing Intel CPUs, there are no higher end parts, again, because I ran out of time. So while the graphs will include the Ryzen 7 3700X, for example, I wasn't able to include the Core i7 8700K. Just want to be clear that this wasn't done to make AMD CPUs look faster. There's always some crazy claims like that whenever certain CPUs are missing because, we don't have all the time in the world to test everything. Intel is faster for gaming at the high end. I've said that many times. I just simply ran out of time, and we will update those CPUs shortly for upcoming Intel 10th gen content. So yeah, chill out Intel fans. We're not trying to make AMD look faster for gaming. It's just what it is, as I said. It's a time thing, I think I mentioned that. So anyway, with all that out of the way, let's just get on with the results. First up, we have the Cinebench R20 multi-core results, and here we see that the R3 3300X is able to edge out the R5 1600 and comfortably beat the 9400F by a 10% margin. Also, quite impressively, it was just 7% slower than the R5 2600. The R3 3100 also does well, basically matching the 9400F, making it almost 50% faster than the Core i3 9100F. The single-core performance of the R3 3300X is also very strong. Here it was 19% faster than the 9400F, while the R3 3100 easily outpaced the 9100F, beating it by a 16% margin. Using 7-zip to measure compression performance, we see that the R3 3300X is slightly ahead of the R5 1600, while the R3 3100 is slightly behind. However, both easily beat the competing Intel parts and were even faster than the Core i7 7700K. And decompression performance was just as impressive. Here the R3 3300X was 24% faster than 9400F, while the R3 3100 was almost 70% faster than the 9100F. Here's a look at AES performance, and here we're once again looking at very strong performance for these new quad-core processors. The R3 3300X was 21% faster than the 9400F and 37% faster than the 7700K, while the 3100 absolutely crushed the 9100F by an almost 50% margin. The Ryzen 3 3300X was also 11% faster than the Core i5 9400F in the Blender Open Data benchmark, and this saw it once again deliver similar performance to the Ryzen 5 1600. And we see that the R3 3100 again dominated the 9100F, this time beating it by a convincing 45% margin. Here we have another rendering benchmark with V-Ray, and again, the 3300X does well, matching the R5 1600 to make it 13% faster than the 9400F. Then we see the R3 3100 beating the 9100F by a 38% margin. The R3-3300X isn't able to match the R5-1600 in the Corona benchmark, but it does beat the 7700K by a few percent, making it 14% faster than the 9400F. Again, the R3-3100 easily beat the 9100F, this time by a whopping 52% margin. Code compilation performance for the Ryzen 3 3300X was excellent, basically matching the Ryzen 5 2600, which meant it was 10% faster than the Core i5 9400F. The R3-3100 wasn't much slower than the 7700K, and as such destroyed the 9100F by an almost 50% margin. DaVinci Resolve Studio is a new addition to our benchmarking, and here we see that the R3-3300X scored slightly higher in the Puget Systems benchmark, and that meant it was 16% faster than the 9400F. So pretty well in line with the margins we've seen so far in other applications. The Ryzen 3 3100 was also 57% faster than the Core i3 9100F, so again pretty well in line with some of the applications we've already looked at. Of course, we're still also testing with Adobe Premiere Pro 2020, again using the Puget Systems benchmark. This time the R3-3300X was 19% faster than the 9400F, while the R3-3100 was 42% faster than the 9100F. The 3300X was also 10% faster than the 3100, so not a huge margin there. The Ryzen 3 3300X looks to be a great value option for those using Photoshop. Here it scores 844 points, making it 20% better than the 9400F. Then we see that the Ryzen 3 3100 also outscored the 9100F by a 14% margin, so again these new Ryzen 3 CPUs look to be great value options for Photoshop users on a tight budget. And we see similar margins when running the Puget Systems Lightroom Classic benchmark. Here the 3300X edged out the Core i7 7700K, and that made it 8% faster than the 9400F. Meanwhile, the R3-3100 outscored the 9100F by a 15% margin. The last productivity benchmark we're going to look at is After Effects 2020, and again the new Ryzen 3 processors do very well, and they perform very similar to that of the Ryzen 5 2600 and Core i7 7700K. Now here's a quick look at total system consumption. Basically the 3300X is on par with the slightly lower clocked Ryzen 5 3600, while the Ryzen 3 3100 dropped power consumption by almost 10%. Both did use quite a bit more than the Intel alternatives, but then they were also quite a bit faster. Okay, so time for some game benchmarks, and we'll start with Battlefield 5 using the DirectX 11 API. Here the R3-3300X performed exceptionally well, coming in just behind the R5 3600. With 152 FPS on average, it was 7% faster than the 9400F, but 24% faster when comparing the 1% low data. The R3-3100 also performed very well, at least relative to its competition. Although it only matched the average frame rate of the 9100F, it was significantly faster when comparing the 1% low performance, delivering 41% more frames, and that leads to a much smoother and noticeably better gaming experience. Pushing the resolution up to 1440p introduces a slight GPU bottleneck, and although the 7700K hit the lead when looking at the average frame rate, the 1% low results were still down on what the R3-3300X did. The same also goes for the 9400F, which managed to match the average FPS result of the 3300X, but was 22% slow when looking at the 1% low results. The R3-3100 also does very well, and again provided much better 1% low performance when compared to the 9100F. Moving on to Far Cry New Dawn, and here we have a title that's known to play not particularly well with Ryzen CPUs, at least relative to the Intel competition. That said, the R3-3300X is still able to match the 9400F, though the R3-3100 does fall behind the 9100F. Still, overall performance was good and certainly very smooth. Jumping up to 1440p doesn't change too much given how CPU limited we were at 1080p, so the margins are all very similar, though the R3-3300X does just jump ahead of the 9400F. Gears 5 Operations 3 is a new title, and this is the first time we've tested with it. Here the AMD CPUs look very competitive, as the R3-3300X edged out the 7700K, making it 12% faster than the 9400F. The R3-3100 also does quite well, matching the average frame rate of the 9100F, while beating its 1% low result by a 14% margin. As you'd probably expect to see, the results do start to come together at 1440p, and here we see very little difference between most of the CPUs tested. The R5 1600 is really the only processor that noticeably drops away from the pack. Next up we have Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege using the new Vulkan implementation, and here we see a rather wide gap between the 3300X and 3100. Here the more expensive quad-core processor was 15% faster for the average frame rate, and 20% faster when comparing the 1% low performance. The 3300X also managed to match the 2700X, and that meant while it was a little slower than the 7700K for the average frame rate, it was 13% faster when looking at the 1% low data. It was also 30% faster than the 9400F when looking at the same data. Still, the R3-3100 did manage to match the R5-2600, and while that meant the average frame rate performance was comparable with the 9100F, it was 38% faster when comparing the 1% low data. Jumping to 1440p starts to introduce a GPU bottleneck, especially when looking at the average frame rate performance. Still, the 3300X and 3100 do well, beating the competing Intel CPUs when looking at the 1% low data. Ghost Recon Breakpoint was also tested using the Vulkan API, and here we see the Ryzen 3 3300X roughly matching the 2700X, 3600 and 3700X. It was faster than the 9400F by a small margin for the 1% low result, though it was also slightly slower when comparing the average frame rate. The margins do mostly close up at 1440p, and for the most part the difference is negligible. For example, the 9400F was 9% faster than the 3300X when comparing the average frame rate, but slightly slower for the 1% low. Second last game tested is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and here the 3300X is again very impressive, allowing for 102 FPS on average, making it slightly faster than the 7700K and 9400F, beating the Core i5 processor by a 10% margin. The 3100 was also quite impressive, at least relative to the 9100F. As expected, the margins do close up at 1440p, but even here the R3-3100 is clearly much better than the 9100F, thanks to the absolutely massive 59% increase in 1% low performance. And last up we have Red Dead Redemption 2, and here the 3300X is able to match the 7700K, making it slightly faster than the 9400F. Interestingly, the R3-3100 is only able to roughly match the 3400G, and was even slightly worse than the 9100F when comparing 1% low performance. Then we see that the 3300X remains strong at 1440p, basically matching the R5-3600 and R7-3700X. Meanwhile, the R3-3100 was again roughly on par with the 3400G. When it comes to operating temperatures, the 3300X I'd say is comparable to something like the Ryzen 5 3600, and that meant it almost hit 80 degrees in a 21 degree room when using the Wraith Stealth box cooler. The 3100 is a little cooler, peaking at just 70 degrees, while a cheap aftermarket cooler such as the Gamax 200T will drop temperatures by a further 4 to 5 degrees. Out of interest, I clocked both processors at 3.9 GHz to see how they compare in a few tests, and this will give us some idea of how much the clock speed difference between these two processors was influencing performance, opposed to the differences in core configuration. So for a workload like Cinebench, the core topology has little to no impact on performance, as the 3300X and 3100X delivered identical performance when clocked at 3.9 GHz. Whereas out of the box, the 3300X was 11% faster. The Rainbow Six Siege results, on the other hand, they're quite interesting because here the 3300X was 15% faster out of the box, but when matched at the same 3.9 GHz clock speed, the 3300X is still 7.5% faster. So clock speed was only half the issue here, with the other half being the CCX configuration. Unfortunately, due to time, I wasn't able to conduct any additional clock-for-clock testing, but this is something I'll explore more soon. For now though, it seems pretty clear that splitting the cores between two CCXs can hurt the 3100's gaming performance. Okay, so we've looked at a boatload of graphs at this point, so let's try and summarize all this data, and I'm going to focus on the gaming numbers since that's what most of our audience cares about. Also, the application numbers can vary quite a lot depending on the workload, so you're best off individually analyzing the data that's relevant to your use case. So that said, let's take a look at the FPS data with a 7-game average. Here we see that on average, the 3300X is comparable to the 2700X and the older Core i7 7700K. It was also just 4% faster than the 9400F for the average frame rate, but 13% faster when comparing 1% low data. Then when compared to the 1600AF, you're looking at a 16% boost on average. In fact, the Ryzen 3 3100 was on par with the beloved 1600AF, and that meant while it was just 2.5% faster than the 9100F, when comparing the average frame rate, it was 21% faster when looking at the all-important 1% low data. Taking the 1% low data, here's a look at cost per frame. I've included the 1600AF at $85 US, despite the fact that today it costs more like $150. It's not worth buying at $150, so I wanted to include it for reference at the highly desirable $85 price point, as here it was pretty much the go-to option for everyone. The Core i3 9100F ranks well here due to its super low $75 price tag, but there are a few caveats. Firstly, the 9100F suffers poor 1% low performance in a number of modern titles, and that leads to stuttery frame rates and therefore a poor gaming experience. Also, it has a very weak upgrade path, and we're testing it on an expensive Z390 motherboard with high performance memory. then outside of gaming it just gets annihilated in applications, so keep that in mind. The poor 1% low performance in demanding titles is enough for me to recommend you avoid the 9100F for any kind of serious gaming, and for me, this is where the new Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X come in. For just $25 more, the R3 3100 is a substantial upgrade, offering 21% better 1% low performance on average. But of course, we saw examples in titles such as Battlefield 5, where that margin more than doubled. That said, if you can come up with another $20, the Ryzen 3 3300X really seems like the way to go, but in terms of cost per frame, they are actually identical. I just like the 3300X more as it's better quality silicon with a more desirable core configuration. Then when it comes to the Core i5 9400F, the 3300X is the obvious choice. It's faster, cheaper, and it's available on a much better platform. So like I said, it's the obvious choice. Though I'm not sure why you'd be considering the 9400F anyway, because for $15 more, you can get the Ryzen 5 3600, which completely wipes the floor with the Core i5 processor. Well, there you have it. I think it's fair to say the new Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X are the current undisputed budget champions. Not only is the 3300X cheaper than the 9400F, but it offers superior application and gaming performance. It's available on a better platform supporting up to 16 cores, and it can be paired with a $70 B450 motherboard without memory restrictions. And the same really also applies to the 3100 when compared to the 9100F. The Ryzen 3 processor provided better and much more consistent gaming performance with world's better application performance. Granted, the Core i3 processor is $25 cheaper, but entry-level Z390 motherboards cost about $30 more, so the CPU saving is eliminated if you want to run with memory above DDR4 2400, and running the memory at 2400 will reduce performance drastically from what is shown in this video. Now, I said these Ryzen 3 processors are the current undisputed budget champions, and I say current because soon the Core i3 10100 will be on the scene, coming in at a tray price of $120 with 4 cores and 8 threads. So it could be available for a little over $120, but it could also cost like $140. We'll just have to wait and see. Still, we can make some educated guesses as to how well that part will perform, as we know the 10100 will clock a few hundred megahertz lower than the 7700K, and it's also got 25% less L3 cache. Therefore, we can estimate based on that information that the 10100 will be a few frames on average slower than the R3 3300X in games, while the Ryzen 3 processor should be comfortably faster in most applications. Of course, I'm not taking into account any potential IPC gains or other platform variables, so we'll just have to wait and see how all that plays out. But at a guess, it looks like AMD has positioned their new Ryzen 3 parts very well. Something that I'm yet to touch on is overclocking, and both Ryzen 3 parts are of course unlocked, but they might as well be locked, especially the 3300X, because out of the box they appear to be pushed very close to their limits, as is the case with most 3rd gen Ryzen processors. With PBO plus Auto OC enabled, the performance can be boosted by a further 2%. Then when manually overclocking the 3300X, I wasn't actually able to improve performance at all, while the 3100 saw single-digit gains, but that was it. For those of you tossing up between the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X, I'd personally get the 3300X for the higher quality silicon and better optimized core configuration. I think those two things, well, they seem to make spending the extra $20 worth it to me. Then on top of that, you get the superior out-of-the-box performance. Both CPUs will go on sale later this month on the 20th, and motherboards already flashed with a BIOS supporting 3rd gen Ryzen processors won't need to be updated to support these Ryzen 3 models. Finally, something else I haven't touched on but AMD did announce is platform support for the upcoming Zen 3 processors. This is a topic that I feel needs its own video to properly discuss, so I'm not going to do that here. I won't blow out this conclusion with a couple of thousand words, but the short version is Zen 3 processors won't work on 300 and 400 series motherboards, just the 500 series boards and whatever comes after that. So, bit of a bombshell that one, but like I said, there is a lot to discuss around this topic, so we'll do that in a future video. For now though, that is going to do it for my Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X reviews. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, and if you appreciate the work we do at Hardware Unboxed and you'd like to become more involved with the channel, we do have our Patreon account. Check that out, links in the video description. We do monthly live streams. We've got an awesome community over on our Discord server, Q&As, behind the scenes stuff. Anyway, if you're interested, check it out. As I said, the link's in the video description. Above all else though, thank you for watching. I'm your host Steve, and I'll see you again next time.